What I am about to reveal has been suppressed, ridiculed, and deliberately misunderstood for decades. They wanted to silence me, they wanted to dismiss my conclusions as the ramblings of an aging psychologist. But I have spent my entire life studying the depths of human consciousness, and what I discovered about the UFO phenomenon will shatter everything you think you know about reality itself. Let me be clear from the beginning. These objects, these visitors that appear in our skies, are not mechanical craft from distant planets. They are something far more profound, far more ancient, and infinitely more dangerous to our materialistic worldview. I have proven through decades of research, psychological analysis, and direct examination of witness testimonies that UFOs are spiritual beings, manifestations of the collective unconscious breaking through into our physical reality. The evidence, my friends, is everywhere. But first, you must understand why they tried so hard to bury my work. It began in 1946, immediately after the war's end. Reports flooded in from Sweden, Norway, and Finland about mysterious flying objects. Ghost rockets, they called them. But I recognized something in the witness descriptions that sent chills down my spine. These weren't descriptions of machines. They were describing archetypal encounters, the same patterns I had documented in religious visions, mystical experiences, and dreams spanning thousands of years of human history. I spent the next 12 years investigating every case I could access, interviewing witnesses, analyzing their psychological profiles, studying their dreams and subsequent experiences. What I discovered was so disturbing that when I attempted to publish my findings in 1958, the scientific establishment launched a coordinated attack on my credibility. They couldn't allow what I had proven to become public knowledge. Think about this carefully. I had already revolutionized psychology, given the world concepts like the collective unconscious, archetypes, and synchronicity. My work was respected globally, yet the moment I declared that UFOs represented spiritual rather than physical phenomena, suddenly I was dismissed as senile, confused, unscientific. Why such a violent reaction? Because what I had uncovered threatened the very foundation of materialist science. The UFO phenomenon wasn't new. That's what I realized first. Throughout human history, we've documented identical encounters under different cultural frameworks. Medieval Europeans saw angels and demons. Ancient Romans witnessed celestial shields and flying chariots. Indigenous cultures worldwide reported sky beings and spirit visitors. The phenomenon remained constant. Only our interpretation changed with the times. In our modern technological age, the collective unconscious adapted its manifestation to match our expectations. We expect visitors from space, so the archetypes present themselves as spacecraft and extraterrestrial beings. But the underlying reality, the true nature of these encounters, remains what it has always been: spiritual forces breaking through the barrier between the unconscious realm and physical reality. I documented case after case where witnesses experience what I call numinous encounters, moments of overwhelming spiritual significance that transformed their entire worldview. These weren't people seeing machines. They were people experiencing direct contact with archetypal forces that exist in the deepest layers of human consciousness. Here's where my evidence becomes impossible to dismiss. I discovered that UFO sightings followed precise archetypal patterns, specifically the mandala, the ancient symbol of wholeness and spiritual integration that appears spontaneously in human psychology across all cultures. The circular disc, the most common UFO shape reported by witnesses, is the mandala. It represents the self, the totality of the psyche seeking integration and wholeness. When I examined thousands of UFO reports, the consistency was staggering. Witnesses described perfect circles, glowing spheres, rotating discs, all mandala formations appearing in the sky at moments of collective psychological crisis. This wasn't coincidence. After World War II, humanity faced existential terror unlike anything in history. Nuclear annihilation threatened our very existence. Our collective psyche was fragmenting under the weight of technological advancement that outpaced our spiritual development. And in that moment of supreme psychological danger, the archetypes responded. The UFOs appeared not as saviors from space, but as projections from the collective unconscious, attempting to restore balance, to provide a symbol of wholeness when our world had been shattered. The mandala in the sky, the perfect circle, was the psyche's desperate attempt to heal itself through symbolic manifestation. I proved this through psychological analysis of UFO witnesses. These individuals consistently showed signs of what I term individuation crisis, moments where the conscious and unconscious minds struggle for integration. The UFO encounter served as a transformative experience, forcing witnesses to confront aspects of reality beyond their rational understanding. But here's what terrified the establishment. If UFOs were projections of the collective unconscious, that meant consciousness itself could manifest physically observable phenomena. It meant the boundary between mind and matter was far more permeable than materialist science could accept. It meant human consciousness held powers we had barely begun to understand. What I'm about to reveal represents the most suppressed aspect of my UFO research. During my investigations, I discovered that certain witnesses weren't just observing these phenomena passively. They were being actively contacted, their consciousness invaded by these archetypal forces in ways that resembled nothing less than spiritual possession. I interviewed dozens of contactees, individuals who claimed ongoing communication with these entities. The psychological profile was consistent and deeply troubling. These people exhibited what I recognized from my years studying alchemy and mystical traditions as symptoms of spiritual inflation, the dangerous state where an individual's ego becomes possessed by archetypal content from the collective unconscious. The entities weren't benevolent space brothers. They were trickster archetypes, the same forces documented in every religious tradition. They promised enlightenment, advanced knowledge, and spiritual evolution. But what they delivered was psychological fragmentation, obsessive behavior, and the destruction of the individual's connection to traditional spiritual authority. I documented case after case where contactees abandoned their families, their religious faith, their rational judgment, all in service to messages received from these beings. The messages themselves followed predictable patterns: warnings about nuclear war, prophecies of earth changes, promises of salvation through cosmic consciousness. These weren't communications from advanced civilizations. They were archetypal content erupting from the collective unconscious, using these individuals as vessels for manifestation. The similarity to demonic possession in religious literature was impossible to ignore. The sudden personality changes, the compulsive need to spread their message, the grandiose claims of special selection, the isolation from normal human relationships. I had spent years studying medieval accounts of demonic influence, and the patterns were identical. This is why my work was suppressed. I had proven that the UFO phenomenon represented a form of mass psychosis, a collective spiritual crisis, where humanity's unconscious mind was literally breaking through into physical reality. The implications were staggering. If consciousness could manifest as observable phenomena, then the entire materialist worldview collapsed. Science had no framework for understanding reality where mind and matter interpenetrated at this fundamental level. My research into synchronicity, the meaningful coincidence that reveals the connection between psyche and matter, provided the theoretical framework for understanding how spiritual beings could manifest as physical UFO phenomena. Synchronicity proves that consciousness and the physical world are not separate realms but aspects of a unified reality. I discovered that UFO encounters consistently occurred during moments of extreme synchronistic activity in witnesses' lives. They reported dreams predicting the encounter, meaningful coincidences leading them to the sighting location, and profound life changes following the experience. This wasn't random. It was the signature of archetypal activation. The collective unconscious, that deep layer of psyche shared by all humanity, contains what I termed archetypes, universal patterns of behavior and experience inherited through our psychological evolution. When these archetypes activate during times of cultural crisis, they manifest through synchronistic phenomena, meaningful patterns that bridge the gap between inner psychological reality and outer physical events. UFOs represented the ultimate synchronistic manifestation. They appeared precisely when humanity needed them, providing a symbol of transcendence during our darkest existential crisis. But like all archetypal manifestations, they carried tremendous danger. The trickster archetype, the shapeshifter that appears throughout mythology, was at work here, offering apparent salvation while actually deepening humanity's spiritual confusion. I spent countless hours analyzing the timing of major UFO waves. They correlated perfectly with periods of maximum collective anxiety. The 1947 wave came immediately after Hiroshima as nuclear terror gripped human consciousness. The 1952 Washington, D.C. sightings occurred during the height of Cold War paranoia. Every major wave corresponded to moments of extreme collective psychological stress. This pattern proved my thesis. These weren't alien craft responding to human events. They were psychological projections, the collective unconscious manifesting its contents into the physical realm through the mysterious mechanism of synchronicity. The beings piloting these craft weren't extraterrestrial visitors. They were autonomous complexes, fragments of the collective psyche operating with apparent independence. My decades studying alchemy prepared me to understand what was really happening with the UFO phenomenon. The alchemists weren't just primitive chemists. They were psychological researchers documenting the transformation of consciousness through symbolic language, and what they described matched perfectly with the UFO encounter experience. The alchemical opus, the great work of transforming lead into gold, was actually describing the psychological process of integrating unconscious contents into consciousness. The stages they documented, the nigredo, the albedo, the rubedo, were stages of psychological death and rebirth. And UFO contactees went through identical transformations. Witnesses described their encounters in alchemical terms without realizing it. The blinding light corresponding to the albedo, the whitening stage. The profound terror and ego death, the nigredo, the blackening. The spiritual rebirth and sense of cosmic connection, the rubedo, the reddening. They were undergoing forced alchemical transformation, psychological death and rebirth, triggered by contact with archetypal forces. But here's what I realized with growing horror. Alchemy requires careful preparation, moral development, and spiritual discipline. The alchemists spent lifetimes preparing themselves for these transformative encounters with the unconscious. UFO contactees were being thrust into alchemical transformation without preparation, without understanding, without the spiritual maturity to integrate what they experienced. The result was psychological catastrophe disguised as enlightenment. These individuals believed they had been chosen for spiritual elevation. In reality, they had been possessed by unconscious contents they couldn't integrate. They became missionaries for forces they didn't understand, spreading psychological contagion to everyone they encountered. I warned in my writings that mass UFO encounters could trigger collective psychosis on an unprecedented scale. If millions of people simultaneously experienced contact with these archetypal forces without the psychological and spiritual framework to integrate the experience, the result would be the collapse of rational consciousness itself. Humanity would regress into a state of primitive participation mystique, where the boundary between self and other, between mind and world, dissolved entirely. I also made a prediction that caused my remaining mainstream support to evaporate. I declared that the UFO phenomenon would escalate, culminating in a collective visionary experience that would fundamentally transform human consciousness. But I warned this transformation carried equal potential for spiritual evolution or psychological destruction. I saw the pattern clearly. The collective unconscious was preparing humanity for a massive archetypal encounter. The gradual increase in sightings, the growing cultural obsession with space visitors, the breakdown of traditional religious frameworks, all of it was building toward a climactic moment of contact. When this moment came, humanity would face a choice. We could recognize these entities for what they truly were, projections of our own collective psyche, and use the encounter as an opportunity for genuine psychological and spiritual growth. Or we could mistake them for external saviors, surrendering our psychological autonomy to archetypal forces that would possess us completely. I tried to warn people. I wrote extensively about the spiritual danger posed by the UFO phenomenon, but my warnings were dismissed as the paranoid delusions of an old man. They couldn't see what I saw. They couldn't understand that the greatest threats to humanity don't come from the skies. They emerge from the depths of our own unconscious mind. The evidence I compiled over 12 years of intensive research proved beyond doubt that UFOs represented spiritual beings, archetypal forces from the collective unconscious manifesting in our physical reality. The circular craft, the mandala in the sky, the transformative encounters, alchemical operations forced upon unprepared witnesses, the synchronistic timing, perfect correlation with collective psychological crisis. The contactee phenomenon, spiritual possession disguised as cosmic enlightenment. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same disturbing conclusion. We weren't being visited by extraterrestrials. We were experiencing the return of the gods, the re-emergence of archetypal powers that humanity had repressed through centuries of rationalism and materialism. And these powers were demanding recognition, forcing themselves into our awareness through increasingly dramatic manifestations. The UFO phenomenon will not remain confined to isolated sightings and individual contactees. The collective unconscious is building toward a global manifestation, a moment when these archetypal forces will reveal themselves to all humanity simultaneously. When that moment comes, remember what I have taught you. These beings are not saviors from the stars. They are aspects of your own psyche, projected outward and clothed in technological garb to match our modern expectations. They will promise enlightenment but deliver spiritual enslavement. They will offer knowledge but destroy wisdom. They will claim to elevate humanity, but their true purpose is to possess our consciousness completely. The only defense against this archetypal invasion is psychological and spiritual development. Know yourself, integrate your shadow, develop your relationship with the self, the true center of psychological wholeness. Maintain your connection to authentic spiritual tradition, not the cosmic consciousness these entities promote, but the genuine religious experience that has guided humanity for millennia. I have proven that UFOs are spiritual beings. The evidence is everywhere for those with eyes to see, in the mandalas filling our skies, in the alchemical transformations of contactees, in the synchronistic patterns of encounters, in the archetypal content of their messages. The question now is whether humanity will recognize the truth before it's too late. They tried to suppress my research. They tried to dismiss my conclusions as unscientific delusion. But I tell you with absolute certainty, the UFO phenomenon represents the most significant spiritual crisis humanity has ever faced. The beings are here. They've always been here, dwelling in the collective unconscious, waiting for moments of cultural weakness to break through into our reality. And now, as traditional spirituality collapses and materialist science proves inadequate to explain our experiences, the barrier between the unconscious and consciousness grows dangerously thin. What happens next will determine the future of human consciousness itself. Will we recognize these entities as projections of our own psyche and use the encounter for genuine growth? Or will we surrender to them, mistaking psychological possession for spiritual evolution? The choice is yours. But remember, I warned you. The evidence was always everywhere. You just needed the courage to see it.